Alright, this is Appalachian Treasures, Part 1. Now, during the 1860s, the Appalachians, as well as other parts of the country, were torn by the war between the states. Life was disrupted, settlements and farms abandoned, mines closed down, and businesses left in ruins. Now, during the war, millions of dollars in gold and silver payrolls and money for arms, ammunition, and equipment moved through the area. Much of it was stolen, hidden, hoarded, or lost. The post-war period saw the Appalachian countryside filled with desperate men and outlaws. Banditry was common, and travelers moved through the area at great risk to their lives. After this relatively brief period of outlawry, the area evolved into relative peace and renewed growth and prosperity. Now today, the Appalachian Mountains are home to an eclectic cultural mix of various races and ethnic groups, each bringing its part over the years to the diversity, uniqueness, and progress of the region. Every one of the cultures has influenced the region's personality, contributing to its economy, its educational system, its cultural heritage, and its folklore. Now, buried treasure in the Appalachians. There is much Appalachian folklore that concerns lost and buried treasures. Some tales derived from the legacies of the Native Americans, others from those of the Spanish conquistadors, early white settlers, and the war between the states. The folklore is distinctly Appalachian, and the tales are replete with colorful narratives of the place, the people, the times, and the age-old quest for wealth and buried treasures. The lure of lost treasure is a powerful one, and hundreds of Appalachian residents as well as travelers to the area have succumbed to it during past generations. Hard times in the Appalachians caused many mines to close, farms to be abandoned, and people to leave. But the search for buried treasure went on unabated, perhaps even stronger. Some communities in the Appalachia did not survive, but the stories did. And like the ancient mountains themselves, they endured. Alright, coming up, we're going to talk about Alabama treasure, the treasure of Redbone Cave, grain miller's buried wealth, lost silver mine of the Cherokee, Flint River Cherokee gold, and the Yuki gold of Paint Rock Valley. Then we're going to talk about Georgia, the secret treasure tunnel of Georgia Cherokee, the lost treasure of the Red Bank Cherokee, the wandering Confederate treasury, the Cohutta Mountain gold, and the lost slave gold vein. Now, the treasure of Redbone. Somewhere on the north side of the Tennessee River, near Muscle Shoals, is an elusive limestone cavern which may contain several $1 million worth of gold ingots and jewelry. This treasure cave has been known of for centuries, but efforts to locate it during the past 250 years have not succeeded. Legend attributes the origin of the gold to Spanish explorers who came to this region under the leadership of Hernando de Soto. In 1538, Charles V of Spain gave de Soto ample funding and a company of more than 600 men to travel to the New World to search for silver and gold. The ore was to be smelted, cast into ingots, and shipped to the motherland, Spain. Arriving in Florida after months crossing the Atlantic Ocean, De Soto and his company of soldiers, miners, and priests traveled, explored, and prospected vast portions of the southern United States from the East Coast to the Ozark Mountains. According to ancient records and documents found in Spanish monasteries, the explorers were successful, for they eventually shipped hundreds of millions of dollars worth of gold and silver back to the Iberian Peninsula. As well as mining for it, De Soto's men took great quantities of gold from several of the Cherokee villages they encountered in their explorations. Though the Cherokee did not measure wealth with gold, they used the metal to fashion bracelets and other jewelry. When the Spanish saw the abundance of gold the Indians possessed, they took it by force, often killing hundreds of the red men in the process. The jewelry was melted down and formed into brick-sized ingots. Now, a Spanish detachment that had just raided several Cherokee villages was leading a gold-laden pack train of some 40 horses when it chanced upon a friendly Chickasaw encampment in what is now northeastern Alabama. The settlement was a few miles south of the Tennessee River along a tributary that provided good water for drinking and crops. Now, as water was coming, the Chickasaw invited the As winter was coming, the Chickasaw invited the newcomers to remain in their village until the cold weather passed. The Spaniards accepted the invitation and lived for a time with the Indians, joining in their hunts for game. Now, when spring finally came, the Spaniards began preparing to travel to the southwest to rendezvous with De Soto at a location designated earlier. Before their departure, however, the leader of the party demanded of the Chickasaw chief some 100 of the tribe's young women to accompany the soldiers on their journey. When the chief refused, the Spaniards became belligerent and threatening. While they were loading their gold on the pack horses, the Spaniards were surprised by a sudden attack from the enraged Chickasaw. Panicked, the soldiers hastily mounted their horses and fled from the village, leaving behind the great treasure in gold ingots. The Chickasaw pursued the Spaniards northward to the bank of the Tennessee River. With their retreat cut off, the soldiers turned and fought. The battle lasted nearly an hour, and when it was over, most of the Spaniards had been killed. After returning to the village, the Chickasaw chief ordered all the treasure carried to a cave across the wide river to the north and concealed within it. This done, the Indians ignored the great fortune in gold cached in the limestone cavern, except when some small amount was needed to make jewelry and ornaments. Now the Chickasaw village thrived over the ensuing years, and it was a large and happy community that greeted a young white trapper who entered the region in 1720 in search of beaver. Now the trapper wanted to try his luck along some of the small streams found in the area. He came to the Chickasaw village and requested permission from the chief to set his traps in the nearby streams. The Chickasaw chief, impressed by the young man, granted permission and invited him to live in the village. He did so, and during the following weeks, the chief became very fond of the trapper. The chief had only one child, a daughter, and as he was very old, he was concerned that she find a husband and provide him with a grandson who would eventually lead the tribe. The daughter had spurned the courtship of the many Chickasaw braves, and the chief was beginning to wonder if she would ever wed. The daughter did, however, find the young trapper to her liking, and soon the two of them were spending time together. Now one night, about 2 months after he first entered the Chickasaw village, the trapper was awakened by two Indians. Without a word, they tied his hands behind his back and placed a blindfold over his eyes before he could identify them. He fought as hard as he could, but their combined strength was too much for him. Once he realized he was helpless, he ceased to struggle, and the Indians whispered that no harm would come to him if he followed their instruction. All the rest of that night, in the morning of the following day, the trapper was led through the woods. Once, while the group was stopped to rest, the blindfold slipped slightly from the captive's eyes, and he momentarily saw before him the wide expanse of the Tennessee River and the high limestone bluffs that rose in the distance beyond. A few moments later, he was placed in a canoe and rowed across the river. After a brief hike, the three men came to a place where the air was cold and the ground was damp. The trapper could hear the squeaks of bats and realized he was inside a large cave. 15 minutes further into the cave, the Indians called a halt, untied the trapper, and removed the blindfold. The three men stood in a large chamber illuminated by torches. As the light flickered on the walls of the cave, the trapper looked around and recognized the chief of the Chickasaw village and one of his braves. The chief directed the trapper's eyes to one of the walls of the cave. Stacked like cordwood against the far wall of the chamber were hundreds of ingots of pure gold, reaching nearly to the ceiling. At the foot of the stack were several chests filled with golden jewels and other valuables. The chief told the trapper the tale of the long-ago Spaniards' visit. The chief also told him that the gold he saw in this room was only a part of the total amount hidden in the cave. Taking the trapper to another chamber in the cave, the chief pointed to several skeletons propped against one wall. He said they were the bones of the warriors that had died in the battle with the fleeing Spaniards. The bodies were placed in the cave so their spirits could guard it against intruders. The chief came forward and laid a hand on the trapper's shoulder. He told the young man that if he married his daughter, all the treasure in the other room would be his to keep. If he chose not to marry the daughter, he would be allowed to leave the village unharmed, but was not to know the location of the treasure cave. Now the trapper considered his options. If he married the chief's daughter and remained in the remote Indian village, the wealth would do him little good, as he would have no opportunity to spend it. Remembering his view of the river and the limestone bluff when the blindfold slipped from his eyes earlier that day, he believed he would be able to return and locate the cave on his own. The trapper told the Chickasaw chief he wanted a few days alone to consider the offer. The chief agreed, reattached the bindings and the blindfold, and led the trapper from the cave. Now darkness fell long before the party could reach the village, and as they were all tired, the chief decided to camp for the night near the bank of the river. Late that night, the trapper killed the two Indians while they slept and threw their bodies into the river. He then fled on foot to Fort Rosalie in the Natchez Territory, reaching it after a harrowing journey of several days. At the fort, the trapper invited an old friend to join him in his search for the great treasure of what he called Redbone Cave, naming it after the skeletons of the red men he saw within it. Hiding by day and searching by night, the two men spent the next several weeks trying to find the cave. The trapper's friend grew weary of the fruitless search and soon returned to Fort Rosalie. Now alone, the trapper decided to return to the Chickasaw village. Wary at first, he was surprised when he was warmly welcomed by the Indians. He learned later that no one had ever known that the chief and his accomplice had kidnapped him and taken him from the village that night a few months earlier. The disappearance of the chief and the brave remained a mystery to the Indians. Using the excuse of trapping for furs, the young man continued his search for Redbone Cave. He eventually married the daughter of the dead chief and settled in the village. And though he searched for many years, he was never able to find the cave again. Now in 1723, the trapper's wife died from malaria, and he eventually returned to Fort Rosalie. The settlement, however, had long since been abandoned. It lay in ruins, its people massacred years earlier by the Natchez Indians. The trapper took up residence in the abandoned fort and remained there for the rest of his life. He made several more forays into the Chickasaw wilderness to find Redbone Cave, but never succeeded. In his later years, the old trapper often visited with the boatmen who plied the Tennessee River. He told them his strange tale of gold bars stacked like cordwood against the back wall of the elusive cavern. Many thought the old trapper was crazy, but his tale has endured to the present and has inspired hundreds to search for the gold lying deep within Redbone Cave. Alright, we're going to talk about the Miller's buried wealth. C.E. Sharps was a well-known trader, landowner, and businessman who operated in and around Florence, Alabama during the 1890s. Now, Sharps not only had a penchant for making money, he had a passion for hoarding it. As a result of his many successful business enterprises and his miserly ways, C.E. Sharps became one of the wealthiest men in northwestern Alabama. It was not unexpected then when Sharps purchased White's Mill. The old mill, which served most of the farmers and residents in the area of Florence, had flourished for many years, and Sharps intended to make it even more profitable. In addition to charging the patrons of the mill a small fee for grinding their corn, Sharps began to make large purchases of the crop, which he ground into flour and sold to the Florence citizens. Sharps also bought about 100 acres of forest land nearby, which he planned to clear and plant with corn and other crops. Though intent on reaping large profits, Sharps also provided important jobs for community residents with his mill and related farming activities. A quirk of Sharps's was that he always insisted payment for flour or grinding be made with gold coins. Thus, the businessman accumulated a substantial fortune in gold over the years. Always distrustful of banks, Sharps buried his wealth in several locations around Florence. The gold from the operation of the mill was buried somewhere in the forest nearby. Every 2 weeks or so, Sharps counted the gold he had taken in from the mill, put it in a feed sack, and carried it to a secret location in the forest where he buried it. Sharps employed his young nephew Grady Sharps as an accountant and bookkeeper at the mill. Many times Grady watched his uncle carry the gold-filled sack out into the nearby woods. The old man always returned without the sack some 30 minutes later. Now Grady knew his uncle was burying his wealth somewhere out in the forest, and he longed to know where. But several times he considered following his uncle, but timidity overcame his greed. Now Grady Sharps was a competent bookkeeper and a clear asset to his uncle's business. A family man, Grady often dreamed of the life of luxury a great fortune would provide, but he lacked his uncle's aggressive business orientation. A thin, sallow fellow who looked a bit rodent-like, Grady always seemed content with his life, but secretly dreamed of wielding power and possessing wealth. Once, when Sharps left the mill office with a sack of gold coins, Grady followed him to the limits of the mill property. Because C.E. Sharps was known for his violent temper, Grady was terrified to think what might happen if he were discovered. He quickly returned to his deck inside the mill as his uncle, toting the gold-filled burlap sack, disappeared into the dense woods. Now later, Grady actually followed his uncle into the forest. On that day, the young nephew watched as Sharps filled the feed sack with the precious gold coins, tied a knot in it, and left the mill. Replacing his pen in the inkwell and closing the account books, Grady waited for a few minutes, then rose from his seat and went to the front door of the mill office. In the distance, he could see his uncle disappearing into the forest. Grady hurried to the place where he had last seen the old man and silently followed his tracks. He stayed close enough to keep his uncle in sight, but far enough away so he would not hear him. Once in the woods and out of sight of the mill, Sharps paused every few steps and looked around to make certain he was not being followed. When he believed it safe, he went on a little way, only to stop and repeat the process again and again. Each time his uncle paused, Grady was sure he would be discovered. With each step, his fear grew, but he knew he was close to discovering his uncle's cache of gold. Finally, though, Grady grew so terrified his uncle would see him that he turned and fled back to the mill. The nephew never found where the uncle buried his wealth, and he never tried to follow the old man again. But by June of 1899, the mill had been in operation under Sharps' ownership and management for several years and had prospered nicely. Sharps decided it was time to make some repairs to the old structure, and he hired several men to do the work. Sharps was supervising the reshingling of the mill roof one morning, shouting instructions to several of the laborers. While directing a worker, he lost his footing, slid down the steeply angled roof, and plunged into the mill pond some 70 feet below. Sharps could not swim and drowned before anyone could reach him. With him went the knowledge of the location of the huge cache of gold in the nearby forest. For several months thereafter, Grady Sharps retraced his uncle's trail into the forest. Dozens of times he arrived at the spot where he had turned and fled in fear of discovery, but from that point he could never decide which direction to take. Finally, the nephew gave up in frustration. The historic White's Mill still stands, a relatively quiet tourist attraction in a picturesque part of Appalachian, Alabama. Somewhere, a short distance from the old mill, lies a fortune in buried gold coins, undisturbed for nearly a century. Alright, the lost silver mine of the Cherokee. About 25 miles east of Birmingham, Alabama, lies a portion of the ancient homeland of the Cherokee Indians. The Cherokee were a relatively peaceful tribe that tolerated the settlement of whites in the area with dignity, forbearance, and friendliness. They often traded with the newcomers. Now, the Cherokee were distinct from many of the region's other tribes because of the finely crafted silver necklaces and armbands with which they adorned themselves. The ornaments were fashioned from the purest silver ore, and the craftsmanship was the finest ever seen. The origin of the Cherokee silver was often a topic of discussion among whites, but the Indians refused to reveal the secret. When coal was discovered in the area in 1832 and large-scale mining began, the influx of whites to the region caused concern among the Cherokee, but the Indians stayed friendly and continued to welcome the newcomers. The new coal mining community was called Ironton. Because of the opportunities available in this booming settlement, it grew rapidly. Arriving shortly after Ironton's boom was one Dr. Isaac Stone. Though it is doubtful Stone ever attended a medical college, he opened an office, called himself a physician, and proceeded to treat the ills and infections of the community. Now, Stone was quickly successful and was generally regarded as an important citizen of the town. Now, in 1834, an epidemic of measles broke out among the Cherokee, and the entire village near Ironton was infected. Dozens died, and hundreds more were sick and immobilized from the disease. Stone, hearing of the Cherokee's plight, volunteered to travel to the village and treat the Indians. For several days, he stayed with the tribe, ministering to the stricken until the dread disease finally ran its course, and the tribe was restored to its collective health. In gratitude, the Cherokee invited Stone to remain in the village for a few days as they prepared a feast and celebration in his honor. The physician agreed and moved into one of the huts. While tending the sick, Stone could not help but notice the many fine armbands, necklaces, and other jewelry made from silver. He was intrigued by the great wealth, to which the Cherokee seemed to have access. During his stay in the Indian camp, Stone met an elderly Indian named Chief George. Stone and the old man enjoyed each other's company and often engaged in animated talk. Now, one afternoon, Chief George told him that he held an important position within the tribe. He procured silver from a secret mine northwest of the village. Twice a year, said the Indian, he would select 3 or 4 young braves to help him lead a pack train into the mountains to the mine, dig the precious silver, load it onto the horses, and carry it back to the village. There, the tribe artisans would fashion the ore into the fine ornaments worn by both men and women. During a conversation with the old man, Stone tried to learn the location of the mine, but Chief George quickly changed the topic and would not answer the physician's question. He did, however, make Stone the gift of a silver bracelet. Now, several times, Stone purchased cheap whiskey in Ironton and offered it to the Indians in an attempt to loosen their tongues about the silver. His efforts all failed. Finally, the feast and celebration ended, and Stone went back to Ironton. He carried with him, though, an impelling desire to find the rich silver lode of the Cherokee and mine it for himself. Now, several months later, Stone told some friends of the secret Cherokee mine. At first, they were skeptical of the tale of a rich silver mine, but they were soon won over when Stone showed them the fine bracelet he'd been given. Stone told his friends that the time was approaching when the old Indian would lead one of the trips to the secret mine to get ore. He suggested hiding nearby and trailing the pack train to the source of the wealth. After the Indians had gotten what they needed and left, Stone told his friends the men could enter the mine and take what silver they could carry. Stone's friends agreed to join him in locating the mine. On pretense of checking on the Indians' health, Stone went to the Cherokee village and learned when Chief George would leave for the mine. Several days later, as the morning sun broke over an adjacent ridge, the old Indian, accompanied by 3 young braves, led several pack horses from the village as Stone and his companions lay watching, concealed in the nearby woods. Now, when the Indians had long enough led, the poachers mounted and followed, staying far enough behind to avoid being seen. Now, they followed for about 3 hours and finally arrived at Wolf Creek. There, they lost the trail. The tracks of the ponies entered the creek, but didn't reappear on the other side, and the gravelly bottom of the fast-flowing stream yielded no clues to the direction the Indians had taken. Frustrated, Stone and his men separated into 2 groups and searched both sides of the creek for several miles in each direction. They could find no place where the Indians' ponies had left it. After several hours of searching, one of the men noticed a curious-looking rock on the creek bank, a rock that seemed out of place. Thinking it had been kicked up by one of the Indians' ponies, he dismounted, picked it up, and examined it. Deducing nothing from the 4-pound chunk of rock, he casually placed it in his saddlebag and went on with the search. Late that evening, as Stone and his party convened in the woods at the point where they had first begun tracking the Indians, they saw Chief George and his braves leading the heavily laden pack horses into the Cherokee village. Discouraged, the men returned to Ironton, and Stone never again tried to find the silver. Several months passed, and the story of the Cherokee silver mine was told throughout the area. Soon, prospectors and treasure hunters were combing the hills near the Indian village in search of the ore. It was never found. Sometime later, the tracker who had found the curious rock retrieved it from his saddlebag. On a hunch, he had it assayed and was surprised to learn it was a freshly mined piece of high-grade silver ore. The discovery spurred a renewed search for the mine, but once again, nothing was found. When the Cherokee were removed from the region and relocated to Arkansas and Oklahoma, it was said they gathered up much of their fine silver jewelry and ornaments and buried them inside the mine. They sealed the mine entrance and covered it so it would look like the surrounding forest. The leaders of the tribe vowed they would return one day and retrieve the jewelry, but they never did. Ironton is a ghost town now, and save for the scars of coal mining in the area, there is little evidence that it was once a thriving community. Few people can remember the exact location of the old Cherokee village, but somewhere about a half-day's ride from the site may lie one of the richest silver mines east of the Mississippi River. Alright, we're going to talk about Flint River Cherokee gold. Near the southern end of the Appalachian Mountains in northeastern Alabama, not far from present-day Huntsville, a group of Cherokee once settled and farmed a fertile valley adjacent to the Flint River. For centuries, the Indians lived in peace and harmony, raising crops and hunting the abundant game in the nearby forest. The Cherokee, like most Indians, had little use for money and material wealth, so precious metals like gold and silver were useless to them as units of exchange. The Indians did, though, fashion handsome jewelry and ornaments from the valuable metals when they were available. Now, legend says that the Flint River Cherokee occasionally traded for gold with other tribes far to the east. The specific source of the gold is unknown, but it is a fact that gold was often found and mined in parts of the Appalachians. Travelers and traders who chanced upon the Indian settlement near the Flint River often remarked on the abundance of gold ornaments and jewelry the Cherokee wore. As the relentless tide of Anglo settlement flowed into the southern Appalachians during the 1830s, many newcomers coveted the fertile bottomland of the Flint River Cherokee settlement. The earlier friendliness of trappers and traders in the region was soon replaced by the greed and hostility of settlers. When the whites tried to force the Cherokee from their rich farmland, violence erupted and the Indians repelled the aggressors. The Cherokee were helpless, though against the clandestine political maneuvering that eventually forced them off their homeland at bayonet point. Higher powers decreed that the Flint River lands should be opened to white settlement, and the Indians were forcibly removed by the U.S. Army to reservation lands in what was eventually to become Oklahoma. Now, the journey from the Flint River settlement to the unfamiliar environment of Indian Territory was traumatic for the Cherokee. They were soon followed by hundreds of people from other southern tribes, also evicted from the ancient homelands and forced to follow what came to be called the Trail of Tears. Powerless to resist the hundreds of armed soldiers commanded to escort them to the territory, the Flint River Cherokee made preparations for the long journey. Because few of the Indians had horses, they would travel on foot, and whatever belongings they took would have to be carried on their backs. Much had to be left behind because gold was heavy and of no immediate use to them. The Flint River Cherokee collected all their fine ornaments and jewelry and placed them in a large clay pot. The tribe elders then transported the heavy pot to the edge of the cultivated bottomland and into the nearby woods. In a large clearing, they chose an appropriate place to bury this fortune in gold jewelry. After the large pot of gold was cached, one of the Indians made cryptic slash marks on several nearby white oak trees. When they returned to the village, another of the elders made a map on a tanned deerskin. The map showed the location of the village, several important landmarks, and the buried pot of gold. When the map was completed, the marker rolled it up and placed it in a leather bag. The elders agreed that when the tribe was settled into the new lands in the west, they would return for the gold. The journey along the Trail of Tears was one of terrible deprivation and hardship. Many of the Flint River Indians died of exposure, sickness, and starvation, and it was a decimated tribe that finally reached the assigned lands in the territory. Life for the Cherokee was hard in their new home. The men toiled in the fields trying to coax crops from grudging soil, and the women did the best they could to provide decent homes for their families. In time, the Indians, burdened with the fight for survival, gradually lost their enthusiasm for retrieving the pot of buried gold near the old Flint River settlement. The treasure map prepared by the tribal elder was passed from relative to relative until it finally came into the hands of a Cherokee known only as John. John's grandmother, who cared for the map for many years and passed it on to his mother. When she died in 1912, it fell into John's possession. John grew up in Indian Territory, hearing the tale of the buried pot of gold jewelry somewhere near the old Flint River settlement. When he got the map to the treasure, he decided that as soon as he could, he would go to the ancient homeland of his people and try to find the fortune. John had notions of using the wealth to build a reservation hospital for his tribe. Now, in 1914, when John was 50, he boarded a train in Indian Territory and made the long journey to northeastern Alabama. He carried only a small pack containing a change of clothes and the treasure map. Arriving at the little settlement of Ryland,
John asked for directions to the old Flint River settlement. He learned the place was now a large farm called Belfone and was owned by a man named Shelby Cullum. John hoisted his pack over his shoulder and undertook the 20-mile hike to Belfone. It was early evening when John arrived at the Cullum farm and was directed to the main house by one of the farmhands. The Cherokee introduced himself to Cullum and told him his reason for coming. He politely asked his permission to search the farm for the buried pot of gold jewelry. Cullum, who did not like the looks of the Indian, refused him and told him he didn't want him on the farm. At this point, John pulled the ancient treasure map from his pack and showed it to Cullum. The apparent authenticity of the map softened Cullum's attitude, and he asked John to tell him more about the treasure. John explained the history of the Cherokee gold and told Cullum he would share a portion of it with him if he would only relent and let him conduct a search on the farm. Cullum was a shrewd man and not one to pass up such an opportunity. He knew it would cost him nothing to allow the Indian to search the farm, and if the buried wealth were found, it might mean that Cullum would share in a magnificent fortune. He agreed to John's proposition. He told John he could spend the night in the barn and they would begin the search early the next day. The next morning after breakfast, John and Cullum embarked on a search for the gold. John walked in the lead and from time to time halted and consulted the map for a specific landmark. At one point, John stopped at a tree and pointed to a very old slash mark low on the trunk. The tree was an ancient white oak, and the cut was partially overgrown, but it was clearly a man-made mark. John pointed to the map, which showed a similar mark. They found several more trees with similar markings as they walked around the farm. In one particularly thick part of the woods near the edge of Cullum's tilled acreage, John found a large tree with the image of a human foot carved into it. John turned in the direction the foot indicated, and after several more paces found himself in a wide clearing ringed by huge white oaks. Now John walked over to one of the trees and found several carved symbols on the trunk, beginning at knee level and extending up as high as John could reach. The Cherokee regarded the markings in silence for several minutes. Finally, without a word, he turned and walked away, never to be seen again. Because the Indian left with no explanation, Cullum assumed the carvings on the tree indicated someone had returned earlier and recovered the treasure. The farmer gave the matter no further thought until 3 years later. While searching for a stray calf in the spring of 1917, Cullum came to the clearing he and John had visited 3 years earlier. The clearing looked much the same except for an excavation near the center. On closer investigation, Cullum discovered a large round hole approximately 4 feet deep. Weeds growing in the excavated dirt suggested to the farmer the hole had been dug at least a year earlier. What had been removed from the hole? Farmer Cullum pondered that question all his life. Did the Cherokee John return under cover of night and dig up the treasure so he would not have to share it with Cullum? Was the treasure found at all? Does it, in fact, still lie somewhere in the clearing in the woods adjacent to Belfone Farm? The mystery has never been solved. All right, the Yuchi gold of Paint Rock Valley. It was the last year of the 17th century, and the small company of Spanish soldiers was about to undertake a most perilous journey. A journey to transport millions of dollars worth of gold bars across the frontier to a distant point on the east coast of Florida. For 6 long years, the Spaniards had labored in a rich gold mine deep in the heart of the Sierra Madres of northern Mexico. The original company of some 200 officers, soldiers, miners, and priests had been assigned by the Spanish government to extract the precious metal from the grudging rock of the Sierra Madre. The original force had been depleted to 60 by Indian attacks, disease, and starvation, but with the help of Indian slaves, they stayed and continued the mining operation. At the end of each month, the raw gold was melted down and poured into molds to make brick-sized ingots, which were stacked along one wall of the mine awaiting transport to Spain. Sometimes as many as several hundred gold bars would accumulate before an escort from the government leaders arrived. Now, about 3 times a year, a big pack train, about 60 mules, would come from Mexico City with supplies. Slaves would then load the bars onto the mules, and the wealth would be taken to the Mexican Gulf Coast, transferred to a ship, and sailed to the Iberian Peninsula. The officers in charge of the mine began to cast greedy eyes on the gold. After the first year of operation, they agreed among themselves to catch every fifth ingot in a secret hiding place, intending to ship the gold clandestinely to Europe and set themselves up in business. When enough gold had been stockpiled to satisfy the officers, they planned to pack it north, cross the Rio Grande, and make their way to a designated point somewhere on the northeast coast of Florida. Arrangements had been made with a renegade ship captain to haul the riches back to Europe, where the officers intended to live out their lives in splendor. Now, sometime during the winter of 1699, the officers decided they had put aside enough gold to make them wealthy men. They were ready to undertake the journey to Florida. The gold was loaded onto pack mules, and the unsuspecting enlisted men were commanded to escort the vast wealth across the continent. Before abandoning the area, the Spaniards executed all the Indian slaves, stacked their bodies in the mine, and sealed and disguised the entrance. Several days later, the party crossed the Rio Grande near what is now Del Rio, Texas, and proceeded eastward. There were many rivers to cross in the Texas country, and the spring rains had swollen most of them to flood stage, making travel difficult and often delaying the march for days at a time. The Spaniards also had to deal with hostile Indians along the way, and by the time they reached Louisiana, their numbers had decreased significantly. With fewer men, the pack train of some 20 mule loads of gold ingots was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. As the Spaniards neared the Louisiana Gulf Coast, they learned the Indians in the area were preying on travelers and trappers. Visitors to the region were often tortured, killed, and mutilated. The heads of victims were put on pikes and set in the middle of the trail as a warning to outsiders. Because of the Indian depredations, the Spaniards made a wide swing northeast and passed through what is now central Mississippi and Alabama. Here they were attacked several times by still other tribes, forcing them to veer even further northeast. Eventually they reached a point just north of present-day Tuscaloosa, where the officers ordered a halt so that men and livestock might rest up from the arduous journey. One evening, while the Spaniards were dining around the campfire, a war party of some 70 Indians poured out of the forest and attacked and killed every one of them in minutes. The Indians were of the Yuchi tribe, closely related to the Cherokee. Now, ordinarily, they were not warlike, but like most of the other tribes in the region, they resented the encroachment of outsiders on their land. The Indians, who used gold to make jewelry, led the ingot-laden pack mules back to their village in Paint Rock Valley, about 20 miles east of present-day Huntsville. There, the Yuchi chief ordered the gold stashed in a nearby cave. He did not want any evidence of the intruders' wealth around should his village be visited by friends of the Spaniards. Over the next several generations, Indians occasionally visited the cave to remove some of the gold for making jewelry. But other than the loss of those small amounts from time to time, the cache remained virtually undisturbed. During the Indian removal of the early 1830s, the Yuchi tribe was ordered to vacate Paint Rock Valley. Before leaving, many of the Indians went to the cavern and divided some of the gold within. Several families tried to carry some of the heavy ingots on their journey along the Trail of Tears, but they were forced to bury them along the way. Some members of the tribe escaped the military escort and fled eastward to Tennessee with their share of the gold, settling eventually at Henderson Ridge. Now, the greatest portion of the Spanish ingots remained in the cave. Sometime in the mid-1920s, an aged Indian appeared at Paint Rock Valley, leading 2 fine mules. He claimed he came from Henderson Ridge and was descended from the Yuchi Indians who had originally settled the valley. The old Indian was impressed with the bountiful farming area that was once the site of the village of his forefathers, and he was friendly to all he met. The Indian said he was looking for 2 able-bodied young men to help him load some heavy objects onto the mules, and soon acquired the services of 2 strapping youths, each about 16 years old. The old Indian, the boys, and the 2 mules left early the next morning and began a long trek out of the valley and into the limestone hills. From time to time, the Indian would call a brief halt while he checked notations on a very old map he carried. About an hour into the journey, the Indian told the youths they would have to be blindfolded the rest of the way. At first they demurred, but the old man said it was the Indian way of doing things. So they humored him and let their eyes be covered. With each of the boys holding on to the tail of a mule, the Indian led the way deeper into the hills. The men had walked and climbed for another hour when the youths suddenly noticed the air had turned cooler, and they could hear the echo of their own footsteps. The Indian removed their blindfolds, and they found themselves inside a great cavern with water dripping from ceiling and walls. The Indian lit a torch, handed each of the youths 2 burlap sacks, and led them deeper into the cave. After another 20 minutes of negotiating several big boulders and narrow passageways, they came to a large chamber. Against one wall of the chamber were piled dozens of good-sized rocks, which the Indian asked the boys to remove. They did so and found an irregular jumble of hundreds of brick-sized bars of some kind of metal. One of the boys picked up a bar, hefted it, and suggested it might be lead because of the weight. The Indian merely nodded and asked them to fill the burlap sacks with as many of the bars as they could carry. The 3 men made a total of 4 trips back into the chamber, carrying out burlap sacks containing 3 or 4 of the heavy ingots each time. With difficulty, the Indian loaded the bars into several stout leather packs which were tied to wooden pack frames on the 2 mules. When all the packs were full, the Indian had the boys cover the rest of the ingots with the large rocks they had removed earlier. Though they had carried out several dozen, hundreds still remained in the chamber deep within the cave. When they were ready to leave, the Indian again blindfolded his 2 helpers. Assured they could not see anything, he led them back to the valley. The next day, the old Indian was seen leaving the valley, leading the 2 heavily laden mules toward Tennessee. It was the last time he was seen. Several years later, the 2 boys, now grown men with families, heard the tale of the rich store of Spanish gold ingots cached in a limestone cavern somewhere back in the mountains surrounding Paint Rock Valley. It was then they realized they had carried gold, not lead, out of the cave for the old Indian. For many years afterward, the 2 men tried to find the cave again, but they never did. Now we're going to talk about the secret treasure tunnel of the Georgia Cherokee. In 1835, the Indian Removal Treaty was signed by the leading Cherokee chiefs, and the long wait for the order to leave their homelands and make the journey to the far west had begun. Before the Great Migration to what would eventually become Oklahoma, the leaders of the northeastern Georgia Cherokee plotted to conceal their vast wealth from the greedy white settlers who were moving into the region. The northern Georgia Cherokee were wealthy even by the white man's standard. For many generations, these Indians had traded with tribes as far away as Virginia. Gold from the rich mines of the Virginia Appalachians was particularly prized by the Georgia Cherokee, and with it they crafted the ornate jewelry they wore. Shortly before the removal treaty was to be signed, Rising Fawn, the district chief of the northeastern Georgia Cherokee, called a meeting of all the area sub-chiefs at his home in Setting Down Creek. Rising Fawn proposed to construct a tunnel in the nearby mountains and hide all of the Cherokee wealth in it. When the time was right, a delegation of Indians would be sent from the newly assigned lands in the territory to retrieve it. All of the sub-chiefs present at the meeting agreed, except for the leader of the Red Bank tribe. For reasons of their own, the Red Bank Indians decided to catch their wealth independently of the other Indians. Attending this meeting was one Jacob Scudder, a white man, who had married into the tribe and eventually became a blood brother and sub-chief. Scudder, who was not required to leave the area, was appointed caretaker of the Cherokee wealth in the absence of the Indians, an honor which Scudder accepted willingly and with great humility. Construction of the tunnel began immediately, and each of the sub-chiefs sent teams of laborers who worked day and night burrowing into the hard rock of the southern Appalachians. The excavation of the tunnel was to remain a secret from any and all white men except for Scudder, and when trappers and soldiers visited the area, the digging halted immediately and did not resume until the newcomers had left. The tunnel was sited in an area completely unsuitable for living, grazing, or growing crops. The ground was rocky, the soil thin, the water scarce, and the timber puny and scattered. In short, it was an area unappealing to the white settlers. The tunnel itself was just over 200 feet long and extended deep into a steep rocky outcrop. Along the sides of the long tunnel, the diggers excavated square, room-sized chambers to be used as vaults. Each tribal division was assigned a vault in which to store treasure and other important belongings. The entrance to each vault was a low doorway about 3 to 4 feet high. Soon the announcement came that the Indians were to be removed from their homelands. When word reached the northeastern Cherokee, they had only 48 hours to prepare for the long journey. During that time, families carried their gold and other valuable possessions to the secret tunnel. Many walked with their gold and jewels in packs strapped to their backs. A few came on horseback, leading ponies laden with the accumulated wealth of several generations. Others canoed up the Etowah River to the secret tunnel. Family by family, they deposited their wealth in the tunnel, all intending to return someday to retrieve it. While the tunnel was being dug, the Cherokee carved and scratched many cryptic symbols on the exposed rocks and outcrops around the region, symbols that allegedly pointed to the location of the hidden treasure. Coinciding with the removal announcement was a proclamation that in January of 1838, a new federal mint would be opened in Dahlonega, about 20 miles to the north. A gold deposition center had been ordered by the federal government to accommodate the miners, settlers, and soldiers in the area. The new mint required gold bullion for the minting of coins. Most transactions in the region had until then been conducted with gold nuggets and gold dust. All other forms of money were virtually useless there. According to information gleaned from old Cherokee documents, the Indians robbed an important shipment of gold bound for the new mint. An unescorted wagon carrying the gold was traveling toward Dahlonega from the United States Treasury Department along the old Federal Road. Where the road wound through a particularly dense section of forest, 5 masked Indians halted the coach and relieved it of 7 50-pound gold bars. It is believed that the robbery was planned by Chief Rising Fawn and executed by 5 of his most trusted braves. The 7 bars were presumably taken to the tunnel and added to an already large fortune. Not far from Setting Down Creek lived 2 white families. They had settled in the region several years earlier and were friends with the Cherokee. On the evening before the Indians were to leave, while the 2 families were visiting at one of the homes, the men walked down to Rising Fawn's village to bid the Indians a safe journey and help them load their belongings. The Indians were surprised by the sudden visit of the 2 white men as they were loading gold for transport to the secret tunnel. In the center of the village, a large horse-drawn sled with wooden runners stood, piled with jewelry, gold nuggets, bags of gold dust, and other precious artifacts. Several large clay pots were being filled with gold nuggets. Wide-eyed at the sight of such fantastic wealth, the men could only stand and watch. Rising Fawn spotted the 2 and led them to a part of the village where they could not see the loading of the treasure. As they talked, the men spotted the sled being pulled away by a team of 4 horses and disappearing into the forest on the other side of the village. Presently, Rising Fawn and the 2 men bid each other goodbye, and the farmers left. Later that evening, the 2 men decided that after the Indians left the area the following morning, they would go back to the abandoned village and follow the skid marks of the sled, seeking the treasure's hiding place. The next morning, the 2 men tracked the sled for half a mile. The trail was easily followed, but then the tracks entered a shallow creek and vanished. For the rest of the day, the farmers searched up and down the creek for some sign of tracks. They never found any. Just before dawn that day, the last of the Cherokee treasure had been deposited in the vault. Inside the tunnel were several deadfalls. Should anyone but a Cherokee familiar with the tunnel somehow have gained entrance, they would likely have been killed within minutes by one of the traps. When the wealth was secured and the deadfalls arranged, the opening was filled with large rocks and covered with dirt to make it look like the surrounding landscape. Jacob Scudder and his family watched with sadness as the last of his Cherokee friends and relatives abandoned their homeland and departed on the infamous Trail of Tears. For many years, Scudder lived in and farmed the fertile valley. All that time watching over the secret treasure tunnel, Scudder never saw any of his Indian friends return to recover the buried treasure. Occasionally, he heard from one of the chiefs, but their messages dwelt dwelt mostly on the hard life in the territory and the continuous fight for survival. Scudder grew old and finally died at his farm on Setting Down Creek. When he passed away, he apparently took with him the secret of the Cherokee Treasure Tunnel in the nearby mountains. Searchers since have found many of the carved symbols on the rock outcrops throughout the area, but thus far the cache of gold in the secret tunnel has eluded them. Alright, the lost treasure of the Red Bank Cherokee. While most of the northern tribes of the Georgia Cherokee, under the leadership of Chief Rising Fawn, agreed to relocate peaceably to Indian Territory in the west, the Red Bank tribe resisted every effort of the United States government to remove it from its ancient homelands along Bannister and Bruton Creeks in what is now Forsyth County. The Red Bank Cherokee numbered about 120. Fiercely independent, they seldom went along with the dictates of the district chief. Like most Indians in the region, they possessed stores of gold accumulated over the years in trade with tribes far to the east. The Cherokee prized gold solely for its natural beauty and used it only to make jewelry. But when settlers moving into the area showed a preference for the yellow metal, the Indians began to see the ore as an item of barter. After many generations of trade with the gold-rich eastern tribes, a number of Cherokee families had built huge fortunes of gold nuggets and dust. The Red Bank Cherokee were among the richest of the northern Georgia tribes. When Chief Rising Fawn proposed that all Cherokee conceal their wealth in a secret tunnel and return for it later, the Red Bank tribe alone refused to go along with the plan. Now, always independent, the Red Bank Indians distrusted Rising Fawn and thought him easily intimidated by U.S. government officials. Now, likewise, they distrusted Scudder, the white sub-chief whom Rising Fawn appointed as guardian of the hidden gold. Several of the Red Bank Cherokee accused Scudder of plotting with the whites for the removal of the Indians so that he could secure their abandoned land as well as their abandoned wealth. As the time for removal approached, the Red Bank Cherokee finally realized resisting the soldiers would be futile, and they relented. The night before they left, the tribe met and decided to bury their gold along the banks of Bannister and Bruton Creeks, mark the spots, and return later for the treasure. All through the night, the Indians placed their gold in clay pots, chose locations, dug holes, and buried their fortunes. They then carved and scratched locational markers on granite outcrops and stones in the area. One particular stone, an oblong granite boulder weighing more than 200 pounds, was inscribed with the key to the locations of all the gold caches, believed to number between 8 and 25. The total value of the buried gold of the Red Bank Indians is estimated at $2.6 million at today's exchange rates. Now forced to vacate their lands at Bayonet Point, the next day the Indians put up some mild resistance. After 2 members of the tribe were executed by the army soldiers, they finally turned and began the long trek to Indian Territory. Almost 100 years later, in November of 1932, 3 boys were playing along the bank of Bannister Creek, where it ran through the farm of one F.R. Grover. One of the boys noticed a large whale-shaped granite rock carved with many curious figures and symbols. The boys had heard the tale of the buried Cherokee treasure many times and decided the rock must mark such a catch. Suddenly, seized by an uncommon sense of propriety for boys that young, the 3 of them approached Farmer Grover and asked permission to dig for gold on his farm. Now Grover, an intolerant and cranky sort, refused permission and ordered the trio off his land. That night, the 3 boys returned to the Grover farm with shovels and picks. With considerable difficulty, they rolled the huge rock aside and began digging. About 2 feet below the surface, one of their shovels struck a clay pot. Excited, the boys removed the dirt from around the pot, and with an effort, they lifted it into the to the grassy surface. The youthful treasure hunters could scarcely contain themselves when they held a lantern above the pot and peered into it. Inside the vessel, they found golden jewelry, gold nuggets, and pouches of gold dust. The value of their find was later estimated at $15,540 in 1932. Word of the discovery eventually reached Grover, and he soon found the fresh excavation on his farm. He promptly filed suit against the three boys for the return of the gold, which he claimed rightfully belonged to him. Unfortunately for the young treasure hunters, the court found in favor of Grover. Sometime during the early 1960s, the large stone that marked the disputed cache was obtained by researchers at the University of Georgia and taken to that campus, where it still is. According to the archaeologists who have examined the stone, the carvings of double circles, stickmen, and other odd figures describe locations of buried treasure. Unfortunately, finding the locations of the caches of gold depends on the original position of the large stone, and that exact site remains a mystery. Interviews with many elderly Red Bank Cherokee in the early part of the 20th century substantiated that the treasure caches could be found by deciphering the markings on the large stone and using its location as a starting point. Several old-timers who lived near the Grover farm claimed to know the exact location of the stone before it was removed by the University of Georgia officials. However, when directions interpreted from the stone were followed, nothing was ever found. Now, in 1951, before the stone was removed, several Cherokee men traveled from Oklahoma to the Bannister Creek area in search of the stone. They found it, took several photographs of the markings, and spent a week searching for the gold caches. Like previous searchers, they were unsuccessful. Now, Sam Cranford, an aged part Cherokee whose grandfather once owned the land on which the Grover farm lay, explained why the searches failed. Cranford told investigators that the point from which the rock was removed was not the original location. He claimed the stone was inadvertently pushed several dozen feet from its original place by a road grader as a road was being widened. Anyone who knew the original location of the great stone has long since passed away. While the mysterious markings of the stone have been translated, the information is useless as long as its original position remains unknown. Until then, millions of dollars of Red Bank Cherokee treasure will probably remain hidden, not far below ground near Bannister Creek.
All right, y'all, we're going to talk about the wandering Confederate treasury. Now, the spring of 1865 saw the end of the Confederate States of America. It had suffered terrible defeats, its leaders were leaving, and its treasury was rapidly running out of money. Jefferson Davis and his cabinet held their last official meetings in April at Abbeville, South Carolina, and Washington, Georgia, as the group fled encroaching Union forces. Now, the Confederate treasury, a still significant store of gold and silver coinage, likewise was moved from the depository at Richmond, Virginia, to some undetermined southern location. Some researchers believe the treasure was ordered removed by the departing leaders to protect it. Others of a more cynical nature suggested the deposed leaders wanted the wealth somewhere they might quickly get their hands on it should the nation crumble at the hands of the conquering Yankees. Now, when General Robert E. Lee told President Jefferson Davis that Grant's forces had penetrated the Confederate lines at Petersburg and Richmond was about to be taken, Davis ordered an evacuation of the region. He assigned William H. Parker to move the treasure. Parker was a captain in the Confederate Navy and took his new assignment quite seriously. On the afternoon of April 2nd, 1865, with the help of some 60 midshipmen from a trading vessel anchored on the James River, Parker loaded the entire wealth of the Confederate treasury into a boxcar. It was to be the first of many transfers. Around midnight, the train departed Richmond bearing an estimated $1 million. Some estimates have ranged as highly as $30 million, but little evidence has been offered to support those claims. Now, when the train reached Danville, Parker received additional orders to move the treasure on to Charlotte, North Carolina, and store it in the abandoned United States Mint there. No sooner was this done than Parker learned Stoneman's cavalry was headed in his direction and might be interested in the treasure. Now, Parker had the treasure removed from the mint, packed in barrels and sacks of coffee, flour, and sugar, and reloaded onto the train. Then, to Parker's dismay, he discovered that the railroads were out of service beyond Charlotte. He hastily transferred the containers onto wagons. While loading the treasure, Parker learned that Varina Davis, the wife of the Confederate president, was living in Charlotte with her children. Parker found her and persuaded her to travel south with him
under military escort before the Union soldiers arrived. Now on April 16th, the Parker detachment arrived at Newberry, South Carolina. The trains were running, so Parker had the treasure-filled barrels and sacks loaded into another boxcar and continued to Abbeville. When the detachment reached Abbeville, Miss Davis decided to leave the train and stay with some friends who lived in the quiet South Carolina town. Parker was less at ease than Miss Davis. Convinced the Union cavalry was hot on his heels in pursuit of the treasure, he wished to abandon the area immediately. He decided to travel on to Washington, Georgia, a few miles across the Savannah River to the southwest. As the train didn't go that way, Parker once again ordered the gold and silver loaded onto wagons. He bid farewell to Miss Davis and crossed the river into Georgia. That part of Georgia had not suffered much from the northern raids, and Parker felt certain he could find a sizable Confederate military unit that could take over the gold and silver he was transporting in the wagons. The captain was anxious to be rid of the responsibility of the entire wealth of the Confederate nation. On arriving at Washington, Parker heard that a command of some 200 Confederate soldiers was holding Augusta, about 50 miles to the southeast. Now, after trading flour and coffee to Washington residents for eggs, milk, and chickens, Parker had his men load the treasure once more in a railroad car, and he ordered the train to Augusta. At Augusta, the frustrated Parker discovered it was not as easy to reassign the treasure as he had hoped. The officers there informed him the war was over and that they were merely awaiting the arrival of the Union troops to arrange for an orderly surrender of the town, get their pay, and go home. Possession of the Confederate treasury would seriously complicate matters, they informed Parker, and they wanted nothing to do with it. One of the leaders advised Parker to return the treasure to the civilian leaders of the Confederate government, who at that very moment were fleeing Union soldiers across the Savannah River into Georgia. Among those in flight was President Jefferson Davis himself. Mistakenly, Parker decided Abbeville would be the likeliest place to find Davis to ask him what to do with the treasure. He believed Davis knew his wife was there and would try to find her. The fastest route to Abbeville was back through Washington, so the captain ordered the train to return. There, the monotonous task of loading the gold and silver onto wagons once again undertaken, and the journey to Abbeville was underway. Less than an hour out of Washington, Parker, much to his surprise and chagrin, encountered Miss Davis and her children fleeing Abbeville with a small cavalry escort. She told Parker that she had not seen her husband and had no idea where he was. Now on April 28th, Parker and his command finally arrived at Abbeville, unloaded the wealth from the wagons, stored it in an empty warehouse just outside of town, and placed a heavy guard around it. That evening, as he was dining, Parker received word from one of his scouts that a large contingent of Union forces was a few miles north of the town and would arrive soon. Panicked, Parker ordered his men to reload the treasure into a railroad car. He ordered the engineer to prepare to depart, but before the train could be started, several hundred soldiers appeared at the north end of the town, riding straight for the train. Fortunately for the harried Parker, the soldiers turned out to be a Confederate company escorting President Davis and what was left of his cabinet. Now Parker greeted Davis and related his misadventures with the Confederate treasury. To his great relief, Davis ordered the responsibility for the gold and silver transferred to the acting Secretary of the Treasury, John H. Reagan. Almost as quickly, Reagan transferred the responsibility to John C. Breckinridge, the Secretary of War. Now Breckinridge, not excited about the burden of responsibility for the wealth of the Confederate nation, passed it to General Basil Duke. Now Duke had no one to pass it on to, so he assumed the assignment with his customary rigid military bearing and dignity. Now Duke was one of the few remaining Confederate generals, and his command was a motley assortment of nearly 1,000 poorly armed and equipped volunteers who were deserting in droves. When the soldiers learned the war was over, several at a time would simply slip away and return to their farms throughout the devastated South. Now around midnight of May 2nd, Duke urgently ordered the wealth transferred once again from the boxcar to several wagons. Now, Duke had learned earlier in the evening that Union patrols were thick in the area, and he would be lucky to transport the gold and silver farther south and away from the advancing Yankees. Duke believed Union officials were aware the treasure was in the area and were determined to seize it. With a force of about 1,000 Confederate troops, Duke moved the treasure out of Abbeville in the dark of night. Jefferson Davis and his remaining cabinet, grateful for the escort, rode along. Several of the troops stayed far to the rear of the column, keeping an eye out for pursuit, and dozens more rode along the flanks, prepared to ward off an attack by the Yankees. Now, during the rest stop, around mid-morning of the next day, May 3rd, Duke promised his soldiers that when they reached Washington, they would be paid in gold from the treasury they were escorting. Knowing the war was over and anxious to be on their way, the troops clamored for payment on the spot. The soldiers were also concerned that Union troops might suddenly appear and seize the money before they could get what they were due. For the rest of the day, Duke and a paymaster counted out $32 to each soldier in the command. This done, the wagons were escorted across the Savannah River toward Washington, Georgia, and every few minutes Duke got word that Yankee soldiers were only minutes away from attacking his column. At the first opportunity, he ordered his command to leave the trail and take refuge in a large farmhouse belonging to a man named Moss. Now, the barrels and sacks of gold and silver were unloaded from the wagons and stacked in the farmhouse kitchen. Duke then stationed his men at strategic points around the farmhouse, ready to hold off a Yankee attack on the traveling treasury. The attack never materialized. The Confederates spent the night at the farm, very few of them sleeping since they anticipated trouble at any moment. When scouts reported the next morning that no Yankees were in sight, Duke ordered the treasure reloaded onto the wagons, and it was carried into Washington without incident. Now, at Washington, Duke turned the wealth over to Captain Micaiah Clark, whom Jefferson had earlier that day, in his last official act as President of the Confederacy, appointed Treasurer of the Confederate States of America. Then, Davis, along with his wife and children, fled deeper into the South. They were captured six days later. Captain Micaiah Clark decided that his first obligation as treasurer was to count the money. According to the Treasury record, the exact amount was $288,022.90. It was considerably less than what Parker had left Richmond carrying. And through the succeeding years, there has been much speculation as to what happened to the rest of the money. Parker, writing some 30 years later, suggested that Clark may have submitted a false accounting of what was turned over to him and kept the difference. Many believe that Jefferson Davis, before turning the treasury over to Clark, appropriated much of the wealth and fled with it, burying portions of it in several locations before he was captured. In any event, Clark paid off a few more soldiers out of the funds and had the rest repacked in kegs and wooden boxes. Now, on May 14th, two officials representing a Virginia bank arrived in Washington with a federal order for the total amount of the treasury. The bank apparently held a claim on the wealth, and the two men were commissioned to secure it and return it to Richmond. Following the military order to the letter, Clark turned the entire treasury over to the two bank representatives, who in turn had it loaded onto wagons and under protection of a military escort of some 40 soldiers left for Richmond. Now, most of the soldiers in the escort were young, and very few had seen any action during the war. For that reason, the two bank representatives were nervous throughout the trip. Soon after the column left Washington, a scout reported they were being followed by a gang of outlaws made up of discharged Confederate soldiers and local hooligans. The soldiers were ordered to take extra precautions as the small wagon train lumbered toward the Savannah River. Now, travel was slow, and on the afternoon of May 24th, the party pulled into the front yard of the home of the Reverend Dionysius Chenault, only 12 miles out of Washington. The wagons were pulled into a large horse corral and drawn into a tight defensive circle. The guard was doubled and posted about the corral that night while the rest of the command tried to sleep. Now around midnight, the outlaws struck. Firing only a few shots, they surprised the inexperienced Federal guards, who quickly surrendered. The guards were tied up, and the remaining soldiers, who awakened at the first sound of gunfire, were held at gunpoint by several of the outlaws. The leaders of the gang smashed open the kegs and boxes containing the gold and silver coins and stuffed their saddlebags full of the booty. Thousands of dollars worth of Confederate wealth was spilled onto the ground as the greedy outlaws filled their pockets. Finally, carrying all they could hold, they mounted and rode away on horses, barely able to carry both treasure and rider. One of Reverend Chenault's daughters estimated that well over $100,000 worth of gold and silver coins were recovered from the ground the next day. The outlaws rode northwest to the bank of the Savannah River. Learning they were being pursued by both Confederate soldiers and local law enforcement officials, they hastily dug a pit and buried their wealth in a common cache, intending to return for it when the pursuit was abandoned. A company of soldiers reportedly encountered the bandits the next day and killed all of them. The incredible wealth of gold and silver coins is believed still to lie buried on the south bank of the Savannah River. Members of the Chenault family hurriedly gathered up the fortune and coins that had spilled onto the ground during the robbery. Placing the gold and silver into kitchen pots and wooden crates, they buried it adjacent to a nearby tributary to the Savannah River. No representatives of either the Confederate or Union government ever returned to the Chenault farm to claim that treasure. The Reverend Chenault cautioned his family against digging up the treasure until such time as the passions of the war died down and it will be safe. But it is believed the treasure was never recovered. Searchers for the treasure buried on the Chenault farm are routinely disappointed to learn that the small tributary near where it was cached has been inundated by the waters of Clark's Hill Lake. According to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Chenault portion of the Confederate treasure lies beneath some 30 feet of water. Alright, Cohutta Mountain Gold. There's gold in the Georgia Appalachians and lots of it. Eons ago, when the Great Mountain Range was taking shape, tectonic forces deep beneath the crust were activated. Molten rock under tremendous pressure fought to break through the crust and spread out over the landscape, but the crust held, keeping the magma trapped beneath thousands of feet of rock, where it began to cool. Now the suppressed volcanic material eventually hardened to form granite and related rock. Scattered here and there within the vast underground bodies of igneous, intrusive stone, impressive veins of gold-filled quartz formed. As centuries turned into millennia and millennia into several million-year geological epochs, pressures within the earth forced some of the granite masses closer to the surface. Now, ages of erosion by wind and water removed hundreds of feet of sedimentary deposits, eventually exposing the ancient granite. As streams flowed across the exposed granite, eroding the coarse surface particle by particle, and trapped minerals were exposed. Early Indians who settled in this region often found gold in these mountains, sometimes in great quantity. They mined it, stored vast amounts of it, and used it primarily for ornaments and jewelry. Now, when white trappers and traders arrived in the Georgia Appalachians, they saw the fine gold of the jewelry with which the Indians adorned themselves, and they craved its ore. Soon, prospectors and miners came, rediscovered some of the gold, and established mining enterprises. When most of the Indians were removed from the region in the 1830s, greedy and enterprising whites moved into the lands formerly held by the Indians and began extracting the riches from the rock. Several tales of vast gold deposits have come from their area around Cohutta Mountain, about 2.5 miles east of Chatsworth, Georgia, near the Tennessee border. Prior to the Indian removal of the 1930s, a man named William Hassler built a grist mill on the creek that still bears his name. Hassler had settled in the region several years earlier and made friends with the Indians living nearby. The largest of the Indian villages was spread out over the floodplain of Hassler Creek just east of the mill. Hassler ground corn for the Indians and also traded items he shipped in from Virginia. When he first began dealing with the Indians, he saw that they had a lot of gold, and he asked them to pay with that metal. Whenever the Indians ran low on gold, Hassler noticed 3 or 4 of the elders would leave the village and travel along the creek upstream toward Cohutta Mountain. They were usually gone for 3 or 4 days, and when they returned, they carried leather ore sacks filled with gold nuggets that looked to be cut from a rich vein. Now Hassler suspected that the Indians had a rich gold mine back in the mountains, and he was determined to discover its location. One day, when he saw 4 tribal elders departing for Cohutta Mountain, he called for one of the slaves. Oh, we already did that. The miller told the slave, a mere boy, to follow the Indians at a discreet distance and try to find their gold mine. All day long, the young slave followed the trail, staying well behind the elders and just out of sight. When he reached the base of Cohutta Mountain, he lost sight of the Indians and could not locate the trail. As he searched the ground for some sign of passage, the 4 Indians appeared out of the surrounding forest and encircled the tracker. They told him if he ever followed them again, they would kill him and all of his family. The Indians then marched the young slave back to the mill and presented him to Hassler with the same warning. With that, the elders departed, trotting back toward the mountain. Several days later, they were seen returning with more sacks full of gold nuggets. The Indians carried on trade with the miller as if nothing had happened. With the death threat hanging over him, Hassler never again tried to find the secret gold mine on Cohutta Mountain. Many years later, during a lull in the war between the states, 2 soldiers named Pence and Wells were granted a short leave to return to their homes near Cohutta Mountain to round up hogs. As best the story can be reconstructed, the men were hiking along a small stream on the mountain when they discovered the old Indian gold mine. Each man dug several ounces out of a large gold-laced vein deep inside the mine, and then pockets full continued their search for the stray hogs. Once all the hogs were found, the 2 men had to return to their military unit. They put the gold in a shot pouch and hid it in the hollow of a chestnut tree on the mountain. They planned also to return to the mine for more gold after they had served their time in the Confederate Army. In the ensuing months, Wells was killed in action and Pence was wounded badly enough to merit a discharge. The trauma of the war apparently affected Pence's mind to the degree that he had difficulty sleeping and remembering things. His neighbors claimed he had simply gone crazy from his experiences in the war. Now, after several months, Pence had marginally recovered from his wound and decided to make a long hike to the chestnut tree to Cohutta Mountain and retrieve the pouch of gold. He planned to cash in the ore by mining equipment and extract more gold ore from the old Indian mine. Now, Pence searched for several days but couldn't find the chestnut tree. He claimed that the tree was no longer there, but it is likely that he simply couldn't find it again. For the rest of his life, Pence tried to find the ancient Indian gold mine. Years of fruitless searching made him completely lose his mind, and he was eventually sent to an institution. To the last, Pence never wavered from his tale of the rich gold mine he and his friend Wells had discovered that day. Now, around the turn of the century, an old Cherokee Indian showed up in the town of Chatsworth. The old man was little more than a derelict, clothed in tattered rags and obviously hungry. He tried to get work at several places but was chased away. On his second day in town, he struck up a conversation with a group of men and told them that if they would give him $600, he would lead them to the ancient Indian gold mine on Cohutta Mountain. 2 men, James Mullins and Jim Sellers, knew the story of the mine and they agreed to take the risk. The next morning, the Indian led Mullins and Sellers to Cohutta Mountain on horseback. For a day and a half, they traveled up ravine and narrow valley into regions the 2 men had never seen. As they rode, Mullins and Sellers carefully noted landmarks so they could return to the mine, should it be found, without the help of the Indian. Now, midway through the second day, the 3 men rode right up to the gold mine. In 2 hours, Mullins and Sellers dug enough gold from the exposed vein to fill their saddlebags. The old Indian tended the horses and watched as the men carried their newfound wealth from the mine. When their packs were filled, they followed the Indian out of the mountains and back to Chatsworth. Pleased with their investment, Mullins and Sellers paid off the old Indian, who immediately left town and was never seen again. Mullins and Sellers got rich from selling the gold they had brought back from the old Indian mine, but 9 months later their money was gone. They organized a second trip to Cohutta Mountain and the gold mine. On the morning of the second day, out from Chatsworth, Mullins and Sellers got lost. They recognized none of the landmarks on trails, were hopelessly confused, and eventually returned to Chatsworth without finding the mine. The two men tried several more times, but always failed. Now, during the 1930s, a man named Fletcher prospected on and around Cohutta Mountain. Fletcher was originally from England and had come to the U.S. to seek his fortune in the gold fields of Georgia. By the time he arrived, however, most of the mining operations had closed down. Undaunted, the Englishman decided to try his own luck at prospecting and mining and settled in the Cohutta Mountain region, believing that the exposed granite hills still held the promise of gold. After many trips into the mountain, Fletcher returned from one with a sack full of gold he claimed to have dug out of an old abandoned mine. The gold was very pure, and the sale of it made Fletcher rich. Later, Fletcher fell ill and was given only days to live. Just before he died, he asked that his bed be taken outside where he could gaze upon the mountain. He gave the remainder of his fortune and a description of the mine to a friend who had administered to him during his illness. Now, Fletcher told him that inside the mine was a thick vein of quartz woven with 1/8 inch thick strands of pure gold. Fletcher gave directions to the mine, but the friend could not remember them. A few days later, Fletcher passed away, and the secret of the last gold mine of Cohutta Mountain apparently died with him. All right, we're going to talk about the lost slave gold vein. Now, Jacob Scudder, longtime friend and ally of the Cherokee Indians, was a prosperous Cherokee County farmer. He owned hundreds of acres of rich Georgia bottomland, raising on it bountiful crops of corn and fine herds of cattle and horses. Now, slaves worked Scudder's farm. The farmer was reputedly kind and fair to his workers. He fed them well and saw to it that they were never overworked in the fields. When gold was discovered in the county during the 1840s, Scudder even allowed his slaves to pan for gold after their day's work was done. The only restriction he placed on them was that they had to give him the first option to purchase their gold. In this way, Scudder gained a great deal of gold, and many of his slaves bought their freedom. One of Scudder's most valued workers was a slave named Black Dan Riley. Now, Black Dan was in his 40s, soft-spoken, and a competent and valued field hand. The other slaves looked to Black Dan as their leader, and he was often their spokesman when important issues arose. Now, Scudder and Black Dan got along very well, and when the slave approached the farmer about purchasing freedom for himself and his wife, Lucinda, Scudder readily agreed. Scudder offered to set Black Dan up as a sharecropper, providing him with a piece of land on which he could build a cabin and raise livestock of his own. Black Dan and Lucinda agreed to stay. Gold fever was running through America then. Gold had been discovered in Virginia several years earlier, prompting a rush of people into the area and creating several boom towns in the rugged Appalachians to the northeast. Just 2 years earlier, gold had been discovered about 2 miles southwest of the Scudder farm, and miners and opportunists from as far away as New York and Pennsylvania were flocking to the northern Georgia Appalachians to pan independently or work for the newly created Franklin Gold Mining Company or established businesses. Now, in 1849, gold was discovered in California. The promise of instant wealth was so great that Easterners flocked to the Golden State in droves. Many of the men working for Georgia's Franklin mines pulled up stakes and joined the great westward migration. While Black Dan Riley had had some success in panning for gold in the small streams of Cherokee County, he longed to try his luck in the California gold fields. The fever burned hotter as he watched several of his friends pack up and undertake the long journey to California. While farming his sharecropper plot and dreaming of California gold, Black Dan kept panning in the small streams near the Scudder farm. One day he crossed one of Scudder's wide cornfields to reach a narrow creek that marked the eastern boundary of the property. Black Dan had not worked the little stream before and was anxious to see if it had any potential. Now, as he panned likely spots, Black Dan could see slaves working Scudder's cornfield on the other side of the stream. Once in a while, one would wave at him and he would wave back. Black Dan kept panning, gradually moving upstream. At a gentle bend in the stream about 50 yards up, Black Dan found some color in his pan. 15 minutes of working the sight rewarded him with some tiny nuggets. Feeling lucky, he moved a little farther up the stream and began panning another site. He found several more nuggets, and this time they were larger, coarser, and more numerous. He moved upstream and excitedly panned another spot. Again he found even larger, coarser nuggets, so large and plentiful, in fact, that he could actually see them laying in the bottom of the stream bed. Black Dan knew enough about gold to know he was getting close to the source, most likely an exposed vein higher up. For most of the day he panned his way carefully up the stream, feeling sure he was closing in on the source of the gold. Finally he reached a spot where his efforts yielded no gold, deducing that the vein was somewhere between where he then stood and the last place he had panned. Some 30 yards downstream he began his search. Black Dan walked up and down both sides of the stream several times and found nothing, so he decided to pan the stream every 10 feet or so until he isolated the source. Eventually he narrowed his search to a length of about 20 feet. On one side of the stream the land sloped upward and patches of exposed rock could be seen along the bank. Black Dan focused his attention on these outcrops. Digging near the bottom of one, he found the top of a thick vein of quartz. Carefully brushing the dirt away, he discovered pure gold, densely laced throughout. Here at last was the source of the gold in the stream. As Black Dan dug several chunks of ore from the rich vein, he pondered his future. The desire to go to California still burned in his heart, but he also believed he had stumbled onto a small fortune in gold right at his fingertips. He decided to go home and speak to Lucinda about the matter, and together they would decide. Before leaving the site, Black Dan carefully covered over the exposed quartz vein and pocketed the day's yield. He walked home. That evening over supper, Black Dan and Lucinda agreed to travel to California to try their luck in a new place. If they were not happy there, they would return to their northern Georgia farm and dig the gold there. The next day, Black Dan sold his gold to Scudder for $70, bid the farmer farewell, and took off for California, Lucinda with him. Scudder wished his friend luck and invited him to come back if the California adventure proved unsuccessful. But Black Dan did well in the California gold hills. He filed on several claims, all of which richly returned gold ore. After 3 years of panning in the California mountains, Black Dan and Lucinda had an impressive sum of money. Tired of living in primitive conditions in the mountains, they moved to a big city on the California coast where they lived comfortably for the next 20 years. When they were in their 60s, Black Dan and Lucinda began to miss their old home in Georgia. They spoke often of the simple life and the slower pace they remembered in the Appalachian hills. By this time, they had spent most of what had been earned in the gold fields, but they still had enough money left to be considered wealthy by anyone's standards. They returned to Georgia and settled onto a piece of land not far from where Black Dan once sharecropped for Scudder. Scudder had passed away years earlier and others had taken over his farm. Now one day, Black Dan gathered up his gold pan and a shovel and set out for the small stream in the gold-filled quartz vein he had discovered more than 20 years earlier. He found the stream with no trouble, got his bearings, and walked to where he remembered the vein to be. As he climbed the slight incline to the upper reaches of the stream, he noted that during the 20 years he was away, the landscape had changed considerably. Much of the woodland he remembered had been cut down and turned into pastures. The little stream had shifted its course in several places and looked much different. And where before there had always been a strong flow of water, the creek now only held a trickle. Black Dan panned quartz of the little stream as he searched for the quartz vein. He was rewarded with some fine dust in the bottom of his pan, but nothing like he had found 20 years earlier. He tried to remember where he was standing when he waved at the slaves working in the Scudder's field so long ago. But everything seemed so different now. Black Dan was confused. Now when Black Dan reached the place where he thought the rich quartz vein was, he dug into the sloping hillside under one of the rock outcrops. He found nothing. He dug in several more places, but still no quartz. Discouraged and tired, the old gentleman went home, planning to try again the next morning. Now the next day was no more fruitful. Panning in the stream sometimes yielded small amounts of gold, but Black Dan was not satisfied. He longed to find the rich vein. Months passed. At least twice a week, Black Dan could be seen exploring the little stream in search of the elusive vein. When he grew too old to dig, he hired a boy named Carnes to accompany him. He told young Carnes the story of his lost gold and promised to share it with the lad if they found it. Black Dan showed Carnes how to pan the gold out of the stream and taught the boy much of what he knew about the gold mining business. For months they searched the low hills around the little stream, but the quartz vein eluded them. Black Dan Riley died without ever finding his vein. For several years, Carnes continued to search for the gold he firmly believed must exist near the stream at the base of one of the outcrops, but he never found it.